Welcome to Whispering Epochs, where the past whispers you to sleep. Here you'll hear fascinating bedtime stories. Listen until the end to uncover the hidden events of history.
Have you ever wondered about the true cost of power? The grim sacrifices made in the darkest corners of history. Tonight, we peel back the layers of romanticized fiction to plunge into the brutal, unglamorous world of medieval covert operatives. Forget the silver screens and the thrilling tales. The reality was far more chilling, a life teetering on the precipice of desperation and death. These were the phantom figures who, with a whisper and a blade, aimed to rewrite destiny. But what if the very shadows they commanded held secrets so profound, so devastating, that even they, the masters of the unseen, became mere pawns in a much grander, more terrifying game? Before we descend into this abyss of untold truths, take a moment to engage with this journey. Your interaction fuels these expeditions into history's forgotten narratives. And tell me, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you? The global tapestry of our audience always fascinates. Now, dim the lights. Let the soft hum of your surroundings set the scene, and brace yourselves, for tonight we're not just observing history, we're questioning its very foundations. In the unforgiving tapestry of the medieval era, no one chose a life of clandestine violence. No aspiring individual declared, "Today I shall covertly eliminate a figure of authority for a handful of coins and the dubious honor of a 3-day barrel confinement." Such a path wasn't a career. It was the harrowing conclusion to a life derailed. The typical medieval operative wasn't a reclusive master of a hidden order. They were the outcasts, the impoverished, the disgraced soldiers, the cunning former thieves, or those so utterly forgotten by society that their very existence was a phantom. If you possessed wealth, standing, or even a modest holding, you engaged such services. You didn't become one. You were part of the hierarchy that orchestrated, not executed. But if you had just escaped a debtor's grasp, carried a reputation for discreet problem-solving, and could merge with the tavern's shadows unnoticed, congratulations. Somewhere, a purse was about to slide across a table, and a whispered name, far from benign, would seal your fate. You weren't tasked with dispatching an unassuming farmer. Your quarry was often a powerful, corrupt nobleman, a high-ranking ecclesiastical figure with illicit riches, or someone shielded by a dozen protectors and a formidable moat. The allure of the payment was potent, the deed itself horrific, but by the time such an offer was considered, there was nothing left to lose. No kin, no prospects, certainly no provision for their well-being in later life. And the benefits, non-existent. No retirement, no accolades, no respite. You couldn't advertise your services. Your existence depended on silence and swift action. You were a phantom, a whisper, and every utterance about your true occupation was a death sentence. "Oh, I'm merely a traveling merchant," you'd murmur over an ale, gesturing vaguely at non-existent wares. Indeed, no one yearned to be a medieval operative. They were forged in the crucible of a world that consumed and discarded them, leaving behind a hooded figure clutching a crude blade. You were not the hero, nor even the primary antagonist. You were a terrifying, ephemeral footnote, rarely surviving to claim your meager reward. Let's dismantle the first grand illusion. Medieval operatives were not sculpted in serene, candlelit monasteries under the tutelage of enlightened masters, accompanied by ethereal melodies. There were no montages of arduous training, no inspiring lectures. Any skills acquired were learned through the brutal crucible of survival, or repeated near-fatal errors. Most were not seasoned professionals, but desperate amateurs, guided by instinct and the ability to scale walls without a single misplaced footfall. If military experience graced your past, perhaps you understood the proper grip of a blade. Otherwise, the act of striking was intuitive. Escaping with your life, however, demanded a blend of raw cunning and sheer fortune. There were no guidebooks, no professional associations, no safety briefings. You didn't learn how to identify decoys or discover hidden escape routes from noble chambers. You discovered these truths while suspended from a precarious window ledge, contemplating whether you'd stumbled into the scullery again. The art of silent killing, the subtle administration of toxins. These were refined through perilous trial and error, with a heavy toll. Sometimes the method worked flawlessly. Other times, your target merely experienced a brief disorientation, their gaze now sharpened with suspicion for their next meal. And sometimes the wrong draught found its way to your own lips. There was no recourse, no remedy, only desperate hope, crude herbal concoctions, and a resilience born of despair. In rare, almost miraculous instances, wisdom might be gleaned from hardened rogues or seasoned mercenaries. Perhaps an elder operative would share the secret of navigating cobblestones without a sound. But true mentorship was an anomaly, fleeting and born of necessity, for those in this grim profession rarely retired. They simply vanished. Weaponry? A stolen dagger, perhaps, a crude strangling cord if you felt audacious, and whatever else could be concealed without a betraying jingle. You were no graceful martial artist. You were a shadow with calloused hands, silent steps, and a profoundly unhealthy affinity for alleyways. Success was not born of rigorous training. It was born of sheer, desperate survival. You learned to extinguish life quickly, messily, then disappear before your visage could be sketched and nailed to a public gallows. In essence, your education was brutal, practical, and utterly devoid of pomp. Only bruises, bloodstains, and the chilling realization of your utter solitude remained.
And why embark upon this perilous journey? Coin, hard, cold, clinking, alluringly spendable coin. The promise of it drew you in. The reality? A tapestry woven with deceit. When an individual sought a silent killer, They sought a singular, untraceable service, devoid of records or witnesses, yourself included. They might offer a pouch of silver, half up front, the remainder upon completion. This was a gesture of profound generosity, but upon completion was a euphemism for after we confirm you haven't botched the job, compromised us, left a trail, or, crucially, survived long enough to speak of it. So you performed the deed. You navigated the labyrinth of shadows, risked everything, perhaps ended a powerful figure's life in their sleep. It was not elegant, not poetic, and upon your return, about that payment, our patron has departed lamentably. Or, more likely, an attempt on your own life. A blade in the dark was a cheaper solution than a promised bonus. Even when the coin was grudgingly handed over, it was never commensurate with the peril, the bloodshed, or the days spent concealed in a flea-infested hayrick wrestling with grim morality. A handful of coins, a curt nod, and a chilling reminder, you were never here. A darker truth, some contracts were mere elaborate traps, political machinations. You'd be instructed to eliminate a dangerous individual, only to find a decoy awaiting, surrounded by a detachment of guards. Congratulations! You had just walked into a fatal snare, your name already etched on the gallows. And should a genuine dispute arise over payment, you couldn't seek legal redress. Your Honor, I wish to sue Lord Bertram for breach of a clandestine agreement. The only court you'd witness would be the one where you were the accused. Thus, you learned to seize what you could, demand recompense up front, and trust absolutely no living soul. Not even the shifty scribe who swore this endeavor would transform your existence.
It did, primarily by curtailing it. To be an operative was to subsist on shattered promises, to vanish before you were utterly broken. So you've accepted the task. The payment is a lie, your survival a flickering candle in a hurricane. Now let's discuss the implements of your trade. Discard the romanticized notions of fantasy novels and stealthy video games. There were no hidden wrist blades, no enigmatic smoke bombs, no enchanted daggers, no crossbows that cleverly folded into your footwear. Your arsenal comprised whatever you could purloin, sharpen, or secrete beneath a tattered garment without a telltale clink. If you were truly blessed, a fortune akin to discovering a gold coin in a dead man's boot, you possessed a decent dagger. Not ornate, not intricately carved like some mythical beast's tooth, simply sharp, ideally free of rust, and crucially, one that didn't carry the lingering scent of your last victim.
Poisons? They existed, certainly, but lacked the theatrical elegance of a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval toxins were volatile and unpredictable, concocted from plants, minerals, or the grim contents of a toad's gut. Some acted swiftly, others took hours. Some merely induced 2 days of violent illness, leaving your target recovering, more furious and intensely suspicious of every communal meal. Ropes were occasionally useful for strangulation, scaling walls, or securing an unconscious figure. But proficiency was paramount. Nothing shattered a covert atmosphere faster than fumbling with knots while wrestling your intended victim. Bows? Effective, yes. If you possessed one, knew how to use it, and weren't attempting to smuggle it through a fortified palace disguised as a floriculturist. Most eliminations were intimate, direct encounters. No scope for elegant marksmanship, just swift, silent, and, ideally, clean enough to avoid immediate detection. And there were no reserves. If your blade bent, broke, or plummeted into a well, improvisation was your only ally. A loose roof tile, a rusty nail, a shoe buckle wielded with deadly intent. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Your tools were hidden in seams, within boots, or, if truly desperate, inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. You kept them close, not for comfort, but because, in your grim profession, your weapon was your closest confidant, your overlord, and your solitary hope for an escape from oblivion. There were no refinements, no meticulous maintenance of your implements between assignments. You didn't polish your gear. You prayed it wouldn't betray you mid-strike, because ultimately the killing was not done by the weapon. It was done by you, alone, ill-equipped, and expected to conjure miracles with a crude implement and a silent plea.
You weren't enlisted to dispatch common brawlers in darkened alleyways. No one compensated you to eliminate the unassuming candlemaker. Your targets held significant sway. Nobles, bishops, military commanders, occasionally even royalty. And such individuals were notoriously difficult to reach. First, the omnipresent guards, not a paltry few, but dozens, armed, armored, and well-nourished. Some patrolled the perimeters, others secured the interior. Some merely exuded an aura of menace, daring you to betray your presence with a single misplaced glance. You would dedicate days to memorizing patrol routes, the telltale creak of a particular door, and the precise number of steps before a heavily armored sentry paused for breath. Second, the fortifications. Castles lacked inviting front porches. They boasted imposing gatehouses, deadly murder holes, and moats teeming with aquatic threats. Even if you avoided the watery demise, you still contended with narrow arrow slits and torrents of boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description implicitly included the possibility of being immolated for a momentary indiscretion.
Third, the ubiquitous servants and staff, the cooks, the scribes, the stable hands. A single suspicious look from you, and whispers would reach the guard captain faster than you could stammer, "I'm merely the herbalist." Operatives weren't solely contending with steel. They were battling the pervasive current of medieval gossip, which, when fueled by the promise of self-preservation, traveled with alarming speed. And finally, your actual target, often riddled with paranoia, and rightfully so. These figures were enveloped by sycophants, relatives with predatory claims to their titles, and a multitude of individuals feigning loyalty. They never consumed food without a taster. They never sought slumber without 3 formidable locks on their chamber door. Some even employed decoy beds or rotated their sleeping quarters like a deadly game of musical chairs. And do not be deceived by the prospect of a grand feast. Yes, they would be inebriated, but so too would you. And you would still need to navigate past royal guards, 3 watchful hounds, a remarkably observant jester, and 50 revelers clutching their tankards. Even gaining proximity to your target could consume weeks, posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, enduring the suffocating confines of a barrel. And when that singular moment finally arrived, you had but one opportunity. One precise, flawless, silent, bloodless, vanishing into the night chance. Or you would become the next gruesome public spectacle, swaying from the castle gate, adorned with a stark proclamation, a valiant yet futile attempt.
Let's confront the visual fallacy. When you envision a medieval operative, you likely conjure images of sleek black vestments, cunning leather accoutrements, perhaps a mysterious hood gracefully billowing in the moonlight. The stark reality? You likely resembled an ailing goat herder with something profoundly illicit to conceal. Disguises in the Middle Ages were far from haute couture. There were no bespoke cloaks or concealed armor. You wore whatever could be scavenged: peasant rags, a monk's habit 2 sizes too large, or the remnants of a guard's uniform that undeniably retained the pungent aroma of its previous occupant. The objective was simple: to disappear into the crowd. But blending in meant adopting the very image of hardship, looking like someone who hadn't seen a bath in weeks, bore the limp of old injuries, and possessed the nervous tremor of perpetual hunger. Your tell wasn't a mysterious cloak. It was the subtle, repeated adjustment of a belt, concealing a blade clumsily wrapped in cloth. And forget the theatrical masks of lore. Anything covering your face would likely brand you a leper, excellent for warding off conversation, but disastrous for infiltrating any gathering of note. Should anyone question your identity, quick wit was your only shield. I am Brother Elias, dedicated to quiet contemplation and the meticulous upkeep of rooftops. Even if you managed to slip past the initial sentries, noble households were not bastions of naivety. Servants, ever watchful, immediately spotted an unfamiliar face, especially one clumsy with chamber pots or unable to name the head cook's favored feline. You were always one curious glance away from a swift blow to the head with a candelabra. If by some miracle your disguise held, congratulations. Now you faced hours of maintaining your act, feigning disinterest in the countless individuals just begging for an unforeseen accident. And the idea of wigs? A laughable fantasy. To appear older or younger, your options were crude: smearing dirt on your face, squinting perpetually, and praying no one noticed the sticky residue of honey holding your makeshift beard in place. In truth, your disguise offered at best 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you either had to be gone, truly invisible, or a master of impromptu theatricals. Should your ruse be unmasked,
Well, let's just say no one yearned to be the assassin apprehended in the bishop's linen room, clad in a nun's habit and clutching a sword, especially not during a grand feast. In the harsh reality of medieval times, the silent killer operated in chilling isolation. There was no loyal crossbow-wielding sidekick, no brilliant alchemist hidden in a secret subterranean lair, no encouraging handler supplying coded missives. There was only you, a rusted blade, and an insurmountable mountain of crippling distrust. Guilds, not in any sense you could rely upon. Whispers of a brotherhood of assassins were largely the drunken ramblings of bored tavern patrons. You were more likely to encounter a spectral presence than another professional killer interested in networking. Why such profound isolation? Because in your grim trade, every shred of knowledge about your existence diminished your lifespan. Every contact was a perilous gamble. Every loose tongue a potential noose around your neck. Even your client might be unaware of your true name, and if they were, you were already meticulously planning your immediate disappearance. Companionship? A ludicrous notion. Friends posed questions. Lovers noticed the fresh bruises, the lingering bloodstains, and the chilling glint of the blade habitually tucked beneath your pillow. You couldn't establish roots. You simply couldn't afford to. One misstep, one fleeting recognition in a bustling market, and your entire existence would devolve into a desperate sprint for the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers might be convivial, but you were the individual who made people vanish. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one willingly shared a meal with someone whose profession could summon a torch-wielding mob. And expect no solace. You couldn't confess the sleepless nights after silently ending a corrupt dignitary's life. To speak of your work was to be labeled a liar, or, more accurately, a dangerous threat. So you guarded your secrets, your scars, and your grim implements fiercely. In inns, you occupied the darkest corner, back pressed against the wall, eyes constantly sweeping the entrance. You never drank beyond caution, never lingered beyond a single night. Your name remained unspoken unless payment preceded it, and even then it was likely a fabrication. To be a medieval shadow was to master the art of vanishing, not merely from a crowd, but from every semblance of the life you were denied.
So, you accepted the assignment. You painstakingly plotted your ingress. You cleverly bribed the unwitting doorman. You donned a surprisingly convincing guise as a chimney sweep. And then you faltered. Perhaps your target unexpectedly turned. Perhaps they were accompanied by their child. Perhaps a sudden tremor seized your hand, trembling like a frightened creature. What then? You are now irrevocably condemned. For failure in the life of a medieval operative was not a mere reprimand or a poor performance review. It was a public, agonizing, and grotesquely theatrical demise, often involving ropes, fire, breaking wheels, or wicked iron contraptions bearing names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant shattering the entire operation. Your target lived, immediately proclaiming the attempt on their life. Suddenly, you were no longer a ghost, but a hunted individual. A detailed description, and likely a crude sketch affixed to every tavern wall for miles. The very guards you once bypassed with ease were now relentlessly motivated. Sometimes, your primary concern wasn't even your target, but your client. A failed mission transformed you from an asset into a perilous liability, someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, compelled to speak. The very individuals who commissioned you would be the first to issue a second contract on you. And there were no second chances. No, my apologies, the blade slipped, I'll try again tomorrow. You had one solitary opportunity, one fleeting moment in time. Botch it, and your best hope was a swift death before anyone discovered who had employed you. Failure also carried a crushing shame, a silent, humiliating burden. You didn't merely fail to eliminate, you failed to remain invisible, to be perfect. For those in your line of work, perfection was survival. Anything less was akin to painting a bullseye on your back and rehearsing your final words. It mattered not how many successful missions graced your past. Your reputation was only as strong as your last success. And if that success eluded you, your only option was to run.
So, you accomplished it. The intricate plan unfolded flawlessly. The dagger found its mark. No screams, no alarm, just a silent collapse to the floor and the profound stillness of a life abruptly ended. Congratulations! Now flee for your very existence. For being a successful medieval operative did not entail sipping fine wine on a rooftop while a city burned below. It meant a frantic flight through labyrinthine back alleys, the fresh stain of blood on your boots, and the ominous scent of a dog already on your trail. There was no victory procession, no celebratory drink with fellow associates, no casual debriefing with your client. You weren't even afforded a moment to survey your grim achievement. The instant your blade struck, your new immediate objective was to evade everyone who now sought to inflict increasingly imaginative forms of death upon you. Guards were converging, doors were being sealed, your escape horse was tied miles away, and you were likely bleeding. Your escape route had to be meticulously planned before the strike itself. Alternative paths, prearranged disguises, hidden safe houses. Perhaps a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least one who asked no questions. For the city would plunge into lockdown within minutes. No one desired a scandal. And lockdown meant bolted gates, armed checkpoints, and dozens of enraged individuals brandishing swords, each clutching a crude sketch of your face, accompanied by the chilling directive, potentially armed and exceedingly dangerous. And consider your client. Assuming they even intended to honor their word, they too would likely vanish. For an operative who had just completed a mission was arguably the most dangerous person alive. You possessed too much knowledge. You had proven your ability to infiltrate places others could not. So even in triumph, you departed with coin in one hand and an enormous target emblazoned on your back. What was your reward? A week of sleeping in drafty hovels, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and feigning the identity of Brother Alaric as you desperately tried to blend with monks journeying eastward.
because success didn't guarantee survival. It merely meant restarting the deadly game in a new city under a new pseudonym with even more relentless pursuers hot on your trail. Yes, you made the kill. Now run as if the hounds of hell nip at your heels.
As if the wretched existence of a medieval operative weren't already dire enough. Poor, relentlessly hunted, and sleeping in places redolent of livestock, you also had to contend with the wonderfully elaborate paranoia of the populace. In the Middle Ages, silent killers weren't merely feared, they were deemed accursed. To the common peasant, you were not simply a hooded murderer. You were an unholy entity, whispering to malevolent spirits, smearing the viscera of toads onto your blade beneath the baleful glow of a full moon. How else could one bypass centuries and dissolve into the darkness? Logic was not a widespread commodity then, but superstition, that permeated every aspect of life. Some believed operatives could transform their very forms. Others claimed you were invisible unless doused in holy water. A popular legend suggested silent killers forged pacts with ancient forest spirits, enabling them to breathe death through solid walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman murmur, "Avert your gaze, he might hex the infant." Even your tools aroused suspicion. A dagger, clearly forged in a cursed inferno. Using poison, that wasn't mere chemistry, it was blatant witchcraft, and you likely stirred your concoctions with a severed digit under a blood-red moon. One might assume this pervasive fear would be advantageous, causing people to avoid you. The reality was far more terrifying. Superstitious mobs do not deliberate. They do not ask questions. They hurl stones, ignite fires, and shriek pronouncements like, "Burn him before he summons the storm." Your very reputation fueled their disproportionate reactions. The instant an unexpected death occurred, illness, accident, even choking on a chicken bone, a whisper would ripple through the village. Perhaps it was the Shadow Man. Perhaps it was him. You could find yourself hunted simply for existing in the same vicinity as a suspicious demise. This meant perpetual movement. Linger too long, and suddenly a priest would be ringing a mournful bell, while 5 furious farmers, pitchforks clutched as if they'd awaited this moment their entire lives, advanced upon you. And heaven help you if anything remotely peculiar was discovered on your person. Dried herbs, unusual coins, or even a foreign accent. That was all it took for someone to scream, "Sorcerer!" and ignite a torch. In a world convinced that monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too swift branded you a dire threat. And in medieval reasoning, threats were to be eliminated, preferably by fire.
Poison, the assassin's supposedly weapon of quiet elegance, a silent kill, no mess, no screams, no jarring clash of steel on bone, just a sip, a stumble, a sigh, and then stillness. That's the romanticized theory.
In grim practice, attempting to poison someone in the Middle Ages was akin to trying to win a tavern brawl with herbal tea and a particularly surly demeanor. Firstly, medieval poisons were notoriously unreliable. You didn't have access to refined cyanide or a neatly packaged pill labeled fast-acting doom. You dealt with plants, fungi, minerals, perhaps an occasional toad. You had to forage, grind, and pray. Even then, it might merely induce a severe stomachache and a renewed dedication from your target's anti-assassin guard detail. There was no scientific precision. Dosing was an educated guess. A touch too little, and the noble simply vomits and cancels dinner. A touch too much, and you risked succumbing to the fumes before the first course was even served. Furthermore, medieval kitchens were chaotic, bustling hives of activity. You couldn't simply waltz in and season the soup with deadly nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in unnoticed, or, most dauntingly, attempt to taint a meal destined to pass through the scrutiny of 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a person of standing, their meals were treated less like sustenance and more like military operations. Every dish was tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the court jester. By the time the food reached their plate, it had navigated more security protocols than a royal wedding. Even assuming you succeeded, the poison slipped in, went undetected, and your target actually ingested it. The ensuing effects were wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, others days. One moment your mark might be laughing at a jest, the next they're clutching their stomach, demanding to consult their astrologer. And if they survived, guess who bore the blame? Not the cook, not the taster, you, the quiet stranger with the herbal knowledge and the twitching eyes. So poisoning was far from efficient. It was risky, agonizingly slow, and riddled with variables none of which favored you. And if you were apprehended, a swift execution was not your fate. Instead, you'd endure brutal interrogation with tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to the household canine. You might assume that successfully altering the course of history by eliminating a tyrant, sabotaging a royal lineage, or silencing a political threat would earn you a place in memory. Not so. You were a ghost, and a ghost's name is never meant to be remembered. At best, you became a fleeting rumor, some hooded figure, a foreigner with piercing, cold eyes, or the quiet individual who never quite finished his ale. You could have executed the most legendary strike of the century and still be relegated to a mysterious, unexplained demise in the official chronicles. In fact, that was precisely the point. Your client sought not a story, but plausible deniability. Before she became the formidable Queen of Macedon, a name whispered with both reverence and dread, Olympia was known as Myrtale, a princess from the rugged tribal heartlands of Epirus. Her people, steeped in ancient lore, proudly claimed direct lineage from the legendary Achilles himself. Whether the blood of heroes truly coursed through her veins remained a mystery, but one truth was undeniable. This was no woman destined to fade into the quiet margins of history. From her earliest years, Myrtale was shrouded in an aura of enigma and sacred ritual. Her upbringing was not merely shaped by the shifting tides of political alliances, but by unsettling prophecies, ecstatic ceremonies, and a profound, almost primal reverence for the ancient gods. She was no demure princess. She was drawn to the coiled mystery of serpents, the chilling revelations of omens, and the frenzied rites of the cult of Dionysus, where women, consumed by divine madness, danced barefoot beneath the moonlight, invoking the very essence of the divine. Her connection to these ancient powers was no mere performance. It was visceral, deeply personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied. Ancient chroniclers, men likely caught between terror and fascination, penned accounts of her keeping sacred serpents within her private chambers, even allowing them to entwine about her as she slept. Was this a literal truth, a testament to her profound connection to the mystic? Or was it the insidious whisper of slander that powerful women often attract? We may never truly know. Yet the tale persisted. To her loyalists, it elevated her to a divine being. To her adversaries, it made her terrifyingly dangerous. Her true ascendancy began not on a battlefield or within a throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight, amidst the hushed incantations of priestesses and the sinuous movements of serpents. She was more than just a princess. She was a living oracle, a woman touched by something far older than fleeting politics and infinitely colder than tempered steel.
So when Philip II of Macedon, a brutal, brilliant strategist renowned for his insatiable appetites, arrived at the mystical island of Samothrace for a sacred initiation, he encountered more than just a beautiful princess. He met a mystery he could not resist. Their subsequent marriage transcended mere political expediency. It was a cataclysmic collision of ancient prophecy and raw power. From its very inception, their union was steeped in potent omens. Some whispered of lightning scorching the heavens on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympia herself dreamt of a thunderbolt descending into her womb, a vivid premonition of the colossal destiny awaiting her offspring. All of these tales would eventually coalesce into legend. But one truth remains immutable. The union of Olympia and Philip II did not merely produce a child. It forged Alexander the Great. And from his very first breath, she was determined to sculpt his destiny, bending the world to his will. Olympia's marriage to Philip II was a far cry from the serene fairy tale one might envision for a queen destined to birth an empire. From the outset, it was a volatile crucible of prophecy, fierce pride, and gnawing paranoia. Philip, ruthless and charismatic, already renowned for accumulating consorts like trophies, married Olympia around 357 BCE. She was likely a mere teenager, yet far from naive. She recognized in Philip a man whose towering ambition mirrored her own, and perhaps a divine counterpart for her profound spiritual calling. Macedon itself was no welcoming court.
It was a land forged in iron and ambition, where kings fell to the blades of kin and brothers transformed into bitter rivals overnight. Yet Olympia, the priestess from Epirus, strode into this volatile realm with her head held high, her gaze already fixed upon the crown.
Their marriage was tumultuous from its earliest days. Philip, for all his political genius, possessed no inclination for monogamy. He would proceed to wed numerous women, often for strategic alliances, always for an expansion of his power. But Olympia was not a woman to languish in the shadows. She cultivated her own sphere of influence, meticulously maintained her own powerful alliances, and was known to frequently consult oracles and perform ancient rites to divine her future, and perhaps the fate of Philip himself. Then came the momentous birth of Alexander. Even his arrival was cloaked in celestial drama. Legends recount Olympia's dream of a thunderbolt striking her womb and flames dancing harmlessly around her newborn child. Philip, it said, had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with the image of a lion. Whether these visions were genuinely believed or shrewdly fabricated, they certainly acted as if Alexander was unequivocally destined to reign not merely over a kingdom, but over the entirety of the known world. Yet even amidst the jubilation surrounding the child, deeper fissures began to fracture the royal marriage. Olympia harbored a burning resentment towards Philip's other wives, particularly his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was far more than a domestic squabble. It was an existential threat. Cleopatra was Macedon-born, and any son she bore would be perceived as having a purer claim in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct challenge to Alexander's future. Olympia grasped the grim reality with chilling clarity. The palace was not a home, it was a battlefield, and she would wield every serpent, every dream, every ritual, and every whispered insinuation to ensure her son was not just remembered, but crowned. She was no longer Myrtilene. She was Olympia now, and no one would usurp her son's rightful throne without facing her unbridled wrath.
By the time Alexander entered his teenage years, the Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a veritable war zone of thinly veiled insults, ruthless political machinations, and venomous rivalries. Olympia wasn't merely vying for influence. She was fighting for her very survival. She understood that the court swarmed with vipers, but it was she who had subtly taught them how to truly strike. Philip II had begun to conspicuously distance himself from her, dedicating more time to military campaigns, indulging in excessive revelry, and perhaps most dangerously, lending an increasingly attentive ear to his Macedonian advisors. The final devastating blow landed when he took a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice as his wife, not the Queen of Egypt, but a Macedonian-born woman whose uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympia, this was not merely an act of betrayal.
It was an unequivocal declaration of war. The marriage ceremony itself was a catastrophic affair. During the subsequent feast, Attalus, in a drunken stupor, openly mocked Olympia and Alexander, audaciously questioning the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he truly Philip's son, or was he the offspring of a god, as Olympia so passionately claimed? It was intended as a grievous insult, but Olympia, with her characteristic shrewdness, seized upon the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It rendered him untouchable. Alexander, in a fit of rage, stormed out of the feast. Olympia, in a calculated strategic retreat, departed Macedon entirely, returning to Epirus. But her exile was not a defeat. It was a brilliant maneuver. In her homeland, she remained royalty, capable of rallying formidable support, whispering subtly into influential ears, and watching with chilling patience as Philip's court began to rot from within. She did not need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the seismic shockwave. Philip was brutally assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he stood on the precipice of invading Persia, on the very verge of crowning himself not merely king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question, a chilling echo, reverberated through every marble corridor and torch-lit hall. Who was truly responsible? Was it Passionaeus, the disgruntled bodyguard who committed the act? Was it the culmination of insidious court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or, whispered in the deepest shadows, was it Olympia? No one could definitively prove it. Few dared to even articulate the suspicion aloud, yet many believed it. After all, within days of Philip's death, Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead, murdered, some chillingly alleged, by Olympia herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon plunged into a maelstrom of mourning and confusion, Olympia made her decisive move. While others scrambled to comprehend the unfolding chaos, she acted with brutal, swift, and absolute precision. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and formidable rival, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympia did not merely arrange her death. She ensured it was symbolic, public, and utterly humiliating. Some whispered that Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter. Others claimed Olympia had the child thrown onto a blazing funeral pyre. What remains undisputed is the absolute absence of mercy. Olympia understood a harsh truth that many mothers in ancient courts refused to acknowledge. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how innocent, represents a future war. And Olympia was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her lineage eradicated, she could now focus her formidable will on securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, audacious, brilliant, already tutored by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But do not be misled. It was not merely his charisma or his father's formidable legacy that facilitated this ascent. It was Olympia. She knew precisely which generals to subtly threaten, which nobles to deftly flatter, and which remaining enemies to quietly, irrevocably remove.
She was not merely protecting her son's rise, she was engineering it. Alexander himself did not always condone her methods. He reportedly disapproved of the violence inflicted upon Cleopatra's family. Yet crucially, he did not intervene, because deep down he understood what Olympia had always known. Power demands blood.
In Macedon, the intricate web of bloodlines was both a divine blessing and a profound curse. With her formidable son now seated on the throne, Olympia began to withdraw from the public eye. Yet this was no retreat into quiet retirement. Instead, she merely transitioned from open displays of power to the more potent, insidious realm of whispered influence. As Alexander meticulously prepared to launch his monumental conquest of Persia, she remained in Macedon, a queen dethroned, yet far from powerless. Her official designation was Queen Mother, but make no mistake, she reigned in all but name. Though the regency was nominally entrusted to Antipater, one of Alexander's most loyal generals, Olympia fiercely refused to be sidelined. She inundated her son with constant letters, advising, warning, and at times sharply chastising him. These were not the tender missives of a doting mother. They were incisive political briefings, laced with cryptic oracular pronouncements and undisguised venom. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, devoured every single word. She relentlessly reminded him of his true enemies, questioned the loyalty of his closest companions, and openly criticized his growing fascination with Persian customs, his choice of foreign wives, and his dangerous flirtation with claiming divine status. No one else dared utter such truths to the burgeoning conqueror, but Olympia, fueled by maternal instinct and the deep conviction in divine will, was utterly fearless. Back in Macedon, Antipater's resentment festered. Olympia ceaselessly undermined him, wielding her royal status, her formidable religious authority, and her extensive family ties to incite opposition. Her influence stretched from Epirus to Thessaly, permeating the aristocracy. She could ignite rumors like wildfire, and for Olympia, a whispered insinuation could be more lethal than a drawn sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander grew increasingly urgent. She warned him of Antipater's treacherous ambition, painting him as a second Philip, poised to betray and usurp. Whether she genuinely believed this, or simply feared losing her iron grip, she relentlessly pressured her son to act. Alexander, however, hesitated. He desperately needed Antipater to maintain stability in Greece while he carved out his empire in Asia. And so the chasm between mother and general widened. Olympia watched. She waited. But beneath her spiritual robes and maternal concern, a profound impatience began to simmer. She had not endured years of brutal palace warfare, only to be governed by an aging soldier. As Alexander's vast empire stretched from the Aegean to India, Olympia perceived the nascent cracks. He was overreaching, trusting too many foreign advisors, and drifting perilously away from the mother and the ancient gods who had forged him. She believed his unparalleled victories stemmed directly from divine favor,
and from her own unwavering influence. If he dared forget that, well, Olympia knew precisely how to remind kings of their true origins, even if that king was her own son.
When the shattering news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BCE, it did not arrive with the blare of trumpets. It landed like a silent, piercing dagger. For Olympia, it was not merely the loss of a beloved son. It was the catastrophic collapse of the entire world she had painstakingly constructed over decades. Her boy, the divine tempest she had prophesied, nurtured, and unleashed upon the world, was gone. And he had left behind no clear successor, no singular heir, only an abyss of chaos. The mighty empire he had carved out was already fracturing. His so-called successors, the ambitious generals, ravenously dividing it among themselves like jackals squabbling over a corpse. Antipater still held significant power in Macedon and Greece, and he harbored no affection for Olympia. Worse, her daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being relentlessly courted by rival generals, each desperate to exploit her royal bloodline as a legitimizing claim to the vacant throne. Olympia foresaw the inevitable. Civil war was not a distant possibility, it was an approaching storm. And once again, she would be forced to act. But this time, Alexander was gone. What she possessed instead was his precious bloodline, his young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxana, still in Macedon, was dangerously vulnerable, the boy even more so. Olympia immediately recognized that the infant was now the last true vestige of her son's legacy, making him both a primary target and an invaluable weapon. She forged a desperate alliance with Roxana and the child, fiercely determined to protect them and leverage the boy's birthright to assert her own claim in the brutal political arena. But the tide was turning against her. The generals who had once bowed before Alexander now held no interest in kneeling to his widow or his formidable mother. They commanded vast armies, harbored boundless ambitions, and nursed deep-seated grudges. Olympia did not flinch. She had confronted vipers, traitors, and kings. A few warlords, adorned with crowns and stolen spears, would not intimidate her. So she plotted. She waited. She observed as Antipater died, replaced by his son, Cassander, a man of chilling resolve, utterly devoid of tolerance for the old queen's intricate games. It was only a matter of time before these two irreconcilable forces collided, the serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who yearned to bury her. Alexander was gone, but his formidable shadow still moved, and Olympia remained coiled within it, perpetually ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, as his vast empire crumbled into a brutal civil war, Olympia executed her most audacious maneuver yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving matriarch, but as a political force imbued with divine fury. The regency had splintered. Cassander, the progeny of her old adversary Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxana, along with the young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympia read the grim portents with chilling clarity. If she did not act now, her grandson would vanish like a whisper at dusk. So she forged a desperate pact with Polyperchon,
an aging general who still commanded a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympia would return, not to plead, but to rule. With Polyperchon's critical backing, she entered Macedon at the head of an army. The moment her feet touched home soil, the political landscape shifted irrevocably. Towns flung open their gates. Soldiers defected to her cause. Even some of her long-standing enemies hesitated. Olympia, despite her advanced age, remained a name that reverberated with earth-shattering power.
Then came her chilling vengeance. One by one she hunted down Cassander's loyalists, and when she finally captured Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his swift execution. According to some harrowing accounts, his wife Eurydice was also captured and offered the chance to take her own life. When she defiantly refused, Olympia had her brutally strangled. It was a calculated display of brutality, meticulously veiled in royal protocol, and Olympia, ever the consummate performer, orchestrated the scene like a goddess delivering ultimate justice. Her message resonated with chilling clarity. Only the sacred bloodline of Alexander possessed the divine right to rule. Everyone else was a contemptible pretender. For a brief, incandescent period, Olympia held the kingdom firmly in her grip. She had, against all odds, restored the dynasty. She had avenged profound betrayals. She had brutally reminded Macedon what unyielding royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like a raging fire in dry grass, and Cassander, ever calculating, remained at large, patiently biding his time. He returned with a vengeance, his army vastly outnumbering hers, his resources far deeper, his cruelty even colder. Her fragile allies began to abandon her. Polyperchon's influence waned. The tide had irrevocably turned. Olympia, now isolated within the formidable fortress of Pydna, watched as her relentless enemies closed in. She had ignited the inferno. Macedon had burned, and now the suffocating smoke billowed thick, her implacable enemies hammering at the very gates.
Olympia, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, utterly alone, cut off, surrounded by the inexorable army of Cassander, who had returned to brutally finish what his father had started. But Olympia did not beg. She did not plead. For nearly a year she endured the relentless siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food dwindled, disease relentlessly crept in, allies vanished like phantoms. Yet within the fortress walls she maintained the same unshakable presence that had once brought kings to their knees. To her very last breath she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the revered mother of a god. Cassander, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew that orchestrating Olympia's death was fraught with peril. Even now, a potent myth enveloped her like an impenetrable shield. She remained, in the eyes of many, the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might be perceived as an act of profound blasphemy. So he offered her safety. Surrender, he declared, and her life would be spared. Olympia knew better. She had witnessed far too many royal promises crumble to dust.
Still, the gnawing hunger was no longer a mere discomfort. It was the harbinger of death. Her garrison eventually broke. Her remaining followers surrendered, and Olympia, unbending until the very bitter end, was finally handed over to her implacable enemies. Cassander did not execute her himself. That would have been too simplistic, too merciful. Instead, he delivered her to the families of those she had ruthlessly executed during her brief, bloody return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here lay the profound irony. When the executioners arrived, no one dared to strike the first blow. Olympia stood tall, regal, silent, her eyes fixed upon them like an oracle gazing through prophetic smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up steeped in tales of her mystical rituals, her chilling visions, her sacred serpents. They had once cheered her son as a living god, and now she stood before them, a frail, aged woman cloaked in enduring myth. Not a single man possessed the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander dispatched others, foreigners, outsiders, individuals who held no memory of her formidable power, only orders to obey. And thus Olympia was finally struck down, not with ceremonial dignity, but with a stark, brutal silence. Her death marked the definitive end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful position of power, and with it the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was ruthlessly snuffed out. Yet even in death, Olympia cast a long, indelible shadow, and history would never truly forget the Serpent Queen. Olympia died not on a throne, but in the dust, disarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she had once ruled. But history is a capricious mistress. It does not always favor those who expire in silken sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing, and Olympia was never destined for a quiet, unremarkable place in history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a keen sword, and prophecy like an unbreakable shield. She was not merely the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the primary architects of his monumental rise. Without her, there would be no pervasive myth of the divine child, no whispered rituals speaking of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that meticulously cleared the path for a teenage king to reign over the known world. Olympia didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with savage claws. Yet, even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympia stands utterly apart. She did not command armies on the battlefield like Cleopatra, nor did she ride into the thick of combat like Boudica. Her battlefield was far subtler, infinitely colder. It was a treacherous world of poisoned goblets, strategic political marriages, powerful priestesses, and cryptic oracles. She profoundly understood the power of fear, and even more significantly, she grasped the potent force of belief. She compelled people to believe her son was divine, and she may very well have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a cold-blooded murderer, a malevolent witch, a cunning manipulator. And they were not wrong.
Olympia was all these things and more. She was the chilling product of a brutal world that respected cunning and power far more than it ever valued kindness. And she learned early that mercy was a dangerous luxury that queens simply could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both fiercely vilified and profoundly mythologized. Some condemned her as a villainess, others hailed her as a visionaire. But no historian, ancient or modern, could ever dismiss her as irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of Alexander like a persistent phantom, always lingering in the background, perpetually just behind the curtain. And perhaps that is precisely where she belonged, not as a tragic mother or a mere footnote in a king's grand story, but as a compelling story unto herself. The woman who meticulously wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside living snakes, and utterly outlived gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago, but her formidable legend endures. In every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-born destiny, in every empire built upon myth, she is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting.
On the sun-drenched island of Crete, mere miles south of the vibrant modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like an ethereal dream than a tangible place. Stone corridors snake in bewildering directions. Rooms twist and double back with disorienting regularity. Staircases ascend into nothingness. Even today, it's easy to lose your bearings within its ancient embrace. This place is Knossos, the resplendent heart of Minoan civilization, and the supposed architectural inspiration for one of humanity's most enduring and terrifying myths, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace unlike anything the ancient world had ever conceived. Built around 1900 BCE and meticulously expanded over centuries, Knossos was far more than a mere royal residence. It was an entire sprawling city contained under one roof, covering nearly 150,000 square feet. It boasted over 1,000 rooms, innovative light wells, vast storage magazines, sacred shrines, bustling workshops, and what may well have been the very first flushing toilets in recorded history. It featured sophisticated running water systems, multi-story apartments, and an intricate network of air circulation. This was no primitive fortress. It was an unparalleled architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, Knossos presents itself as organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it must have felt like pure magic. The individual credited with bringing Knossos into modern awareness was the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans meticulously excavated the site and swiftly became convinced that this sprawling complex was indeed the origin of the famed Greek labyrinth myth. The layout was undeniably disorienting, the architecture deeply symbolic, and everywhere he turned, he discovered ubiquitous motifs of bulls, painted vividly on walls, intricately carved into stone, or sculpted into tiny precious golden charms. The bull, after all, was profoundly sacred to the Minoans. Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the mythic king Minos, solidifying the legend's inseparable link to the ruins. But here lies the captivating twist. No one has ever discovered a literal labyrinth. No sprawling underground maze, no grim prison chambers, no literal half-man, half-monster. What we have instead is something far more mysterious. A city designed in bewildering loops, sprawling wings, and intricate layers deliberately crafted to be difficult to navigate. And the deeper one ventures, the more the distinct lines between documented history and pervasive mythology begin to beautifully, tantalizingly blur. So the haunting question remains, was the Minotaur born from these very walls, or was the palace itself the true monster? Knossos may not surrender its answers easily, but it possesses an uncanny ability to compel us to ask the right, most profound questions.
The myth is as renowned as the ruin itself. A monstrous, half-man, half-bull, eternally trapped within a labyrinth so unfathomably complex that none who entered ever found their way out. Only Theseus, the audacious Athenian hero, managed to slay the beast and escape, guided by a simple ball of thread and the shrewd cunning of Princess Ariadne. But from where did this chilling story originate? And why precisely a labyrinth? The earliest versions of the myth recount the tale of King Minos, the immensely powerful ruler of Crete, who demanded a grim annual tribute from Athens, 7 young boys and 7 young girls. These unfortunate souls were then fed to the Minotaur, a grotesque creature born from an act of divine punishment and profound shame. The Minotaur, confined within an underground maze, symbolized the dark, hidden underbelly of power, something savage and terrifying, secreted away behind a facade of grandeur. To the ancient Greeks, Crete had long been a land of immense wealth, tantalizing mystery, and palpable fear. Their seafaring inhabitants, the Minoans, were perceived as both exquisitely elegant and disturbingly alien. Their enigmatic rituals often involved dramatic bull leaping. Their vibrant artwork depicted strange, powerful deities, and their palaces were unlike anything seen on the mainland. To a visiting Greek from 1000 BCE, Knossos would have felt like a portal to another world entirely. The bull itself held a profound sacred significance in Minoan culture. Vivid frescoes depict live young men and women gracefully vaulting over charging bulls in ritualistic displays. Horns of consecration, stylized bull horns, adorned rooftops and altars across the island. Combine this deep veneration of the bull with a palace that felt inherently labyrinthine, and the potent ingredients for a legendary tale begin to stir. But what if the Minotaur was not merely a literal monster? What if it was a powerful metaphor? Some scholars propose that the tale reflects a distorted memory of Cretan dominance over the Aegean, a historical period when Athens genuinely paid tribute to a stronger, more enigmatic power. The labyrinth in this interpretation could symbolize the political entrapment of weaker states, and the Minotaur, the raw, terrifying, untamed force that underpinned Minoan rule.
Others argue for a more psychological interpretation. The labyrinth as the winding corridors of the unconscious mind, the Minotaur as our hidden primal urges, and Theseus, the courageous hero, venturing bravely into the darkness, guided solely by the slender thread of memory. Regardless, the myth remains inextricably tangled with Knossos. The palace is the closest tangible structure we have ever discovered to a real labyrinth. No literal monster, no Ariadne, but perhaps something far deeper, not merely a myth echoing through history, but a history that inherently begged to become myth. Long before Athens erected its gleaming marble temples, or Sparta honed its formidable spears, there existed the Minoan civilization, one of the earliest truly advanced societies in Europe. They reigned not through brutal conquest, but through an intricate network of trade, exquisite art, and what appears to be an almost supernatural command of architecture. At the beating heart of their formidable power stood Knossos, a palace that was not merely a seat of royalty, but a vibrant hub of culture, profound ritual, and economic prowess. The Minoans flourished from approximately 2600 to 1400 BCE. Centered on Crete, they developed a sprawling, sophisticated trade network that extended to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Spain. Their sleek ships glided through the Mediterranean like silent arrows, transporting pottery, precious saffron, bronze, and luxurious goods. They did not raise vast conquering armies. They meticulously built relationships, and that, more than any weapon, forged their immense wealth. What is perhaps most striking about the Minoan culture is its profound divergence from their later Greek successors. Their artwork celebrated the natural world, animals, and the fluid grace of human movement, conspicuously absent of grand narratives of war or divine punishment. Frescoes depict joyful dancers, playful dolphins, and lithe athletes vaulting over bulls with breathtaking agility. Even their goddesses are distinct, powerful, often bare-breasted figures, frequently holding snakes, potent symbols of fertility, transformation, or protection. At the very nexus of it all was Knossos, not a stern fortress perched atop a hill, but an expansive complex nestled in a fertile valley. It possessed no massive defensive walls, suggesting the Minoans either felt inherently secure on their island or projected such overwhelming maritime power that traditional defenses were rendered unnecessary. Their confidence was manifest in their architecture. Multi-story buildings, elegantly columned courtyards, and remarkably advanced plumbing systems hinted at a society far ahead of its contemporaries. And yet, for all their dazzling sophistication, the Minoans left behind no deciphered written records. Their primary script, Linear A, remains tantalizingly unreadable to this day. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what their kings truly believed, what prayers they uttered, or what truly transpired behind the awe-inspiring walls of Knossos. All that remains are their magnificent ruins, their enigmatic art, and their enduring influence, later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and echoed profoundly in the Greek myths that followed. The Minoans were not merely builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. And Knossos was not merely a building, It was the vibrant, pulsating heart of a civilization that shimmered for a glorious moment like sunlight on the Aegean Sea, and then mysteriously vanished. But some whisper that their echo still wanders its labyrinthine pathways. To walk through Knossos today is to journey through time itself, layered, confusing, and profoundly beautiful time. It is not just the sheer scale of the complex that overwhelms the visitor. It is the deliberate, intricate design. Rooms lead unexpectedly to other rooms. Corridors split and seemingly vanish into the ancient stone. Light wells ingeniously cut through the very heart of the sprawling structure. Staircases spiral into tantalizing shadows or suddenly emerge into sun-drenched courtyards. Nothing moves in a straight, predictable line. It is not difficult to comprehend why ancient visitors might have whispered of a labyrinth. Knossos was not merely a palace, it was a living, breathing organism. Spanning an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex contained over 1,000 chambers, some remarkably tiny, others grand and imposing. These were not haphazardly placed rooms. They were purpose-built workshops, vast storage spaces, sacred shrines, royal apartments, and imposing throne rooms, all meticulously arranged around a massive central courtyard that likely hosted public ceremonies or the legendary bull-leaping rituals. The palace was constructed on multiple levels, reaching 4 or even 5 stories in certain areas, cleverly utilizing natural slopes and artificially created terraces. To navigate it without becoming utterly lost, one would require keen memory, sharp instinct, or a guiding thread, much like the legendary Theseus. And yet, this apparent chaos conceals a remarkable underlying intelligence. The Minoans masterfully employed passive ventilation, cooling rooms through ingeniously designed air shafts and open stairwells. They channeled rainwater through sophisticated clay pipes and, as mentioned, possessed toilets that flushed millennia before Rome ever made such conveniences fashionable.
One of the most iconic areas is the so-called throne room, named for the majestic alabaster chair built directly into the wall, flanked by stone benches. Surrounding it are captivating frescoes of mythical griffins, powerful regal guardians. Was this the seat of a priest-king, a goddess's sacred chamber, a hallowed royal court? No one knows with absolute certainty. And the walls themselves speak in vibrant, living color. Dazzling frescoes depict graceful dolphins swimming above ancient bathtubs. Women in elegant, flounced skirts with bare chests. Lithe youths defying gravity, leaping over bulls mid-air. The art was not mere decoration. It was a profound expression of identity, fluid, natural, intimately connected to the earth and the boundless sea. Still, the deeper one penetrates, the more Knossos begins to truly disorient. Some sections appear intentionally complex, as if designed to confuse or perhaps to safeguard. Perhaps this is the authentic root of the labyrinth legend. Not a grim prison for monsters, but a place that felt vibrantly alive, a monumental structure that invited awe, solemn ritual,
and just a subtle touch of profound fear. No locked doors, no mythical beasts, just a place meticulously built to make you question where you were and what tantalizing mystery awaited around the very next corner. Knossos was not merely an administrative center or a royal residence. It was a place of deep worship, an architectural embodiment of the very Minoan soul, utterly steeped in ritual, potent myth, and a timeless divine mystery.
For centuries, Knossos stood as a vibrant beacon of prosperity, innovative design, and unparalleled cultural sophistication. But then something happened, something sudden, something no one can fully explain. By around 1400 BCE, the palace lay abandoned, its magnificent frescoes left to silently fade, and the entire Minoan civilization that had once commanded the seas had vanished like a fleeting mist over the Aegean. So, what transpired? Theories abound. Some point to nature. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted in one of the most cataclysmic explosions in human history. The sheer force of the blast was so immense that it almost certainly generated devastating tsunamis that battered Crete's northern coast, obliterating vital ports and fertile farmland. Enormous ash clouds may have subsequently blocked the sun, choking crops and disrupting the delicate climate across the region. While Knossos itself wasn't immediately destroyed by the eruption, the catastrophic aftermath may have fundamentally shaken its foundations, economically, politically, and even spiritually. Others look to war. By 1450 BCE, the ascendant power of the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks, may have ruthlessly capitalized on Minoan weakness. Archaeological evidence suggests that Knossos was briefly reoccupied, but the underlying culture had profoundly shifted. The art became notably more martial in theme. Linear A, the enigmatic Minoan script, was replaced with Linear B, a script utilized by Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once thrived with snake goddesses and daring bull dancers now echoed with whispers in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans did not execute a single overwhelming conquest, but rather gradually absorbed the island, first through trade, then through subtle influence, and finally through direct rule. Still others argue that internal collapse, a violent civil uprising, deep political instability, or the catastrophic failure of the ruling elite may have contributed just as significantly to its demise.
What remains striking, however, is the remarkable scarcity of overt violence evident in the ruins themselves. There are no charred skeletons, no widespread signs of mass slaughter. Knossos did not fall with a scream, it faded with a whisper. The grand palatial system simply ceased to function. The once bustling rooms fell silent. The elaborate rituals ended, and nature slowly, relentlessly reclaimed its ancient territory.
By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epic poems, Knossos was already ancient myth, a memory inextricably tangled in tales of powerful kings, terrifying monsters, and bewildering labyrinths. And perhaps that is fitting, because what ultimately vanquished Knossos was not merely a volcanic eruption or an external invasion. It was time, and the inexorable way all great things, no matter how beautiful or sophisticated, eventually vanish beneath the inexorable weight of new empires. But the bones of the palace remain, and if you listen closely, the maze still hums faintly beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried beneath the Cretan soil, just another forgotten mound of stone, lost to the relentless currents of time. Its name slipped from memory, its myths distorted by oral tradition, its ancient walls swallowed by sprawling olive groves and suffocating dust. That is, until one audacious man decided to chase a legend. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, and he didn't just rediscover Knossos, he dramatically reimagined it. In 1900, Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for dramatic pronouncements and a profound love for Homeric myth, purchased the very land that covered the vast ancient ruins. Local farmers had long been unearthing strange seals and intriguing artifacts, tantalizing clues that something enormous lay hidden beneath their feet. Evans began to dig. What he unearthed would forever alter the history of the Aegean. He uncovered a palace so vast, so incredibly complex, and so astonishingly advanced that he became utterly convinced this was the mythical home of King Minos. The vibrant frescoes, the omnipresent horns, the sheer architectural strangeness of the site, it all pointed, in his mind, to one unmistakable conclusion: the labyrinth. Evans was more than just an archaeologist. He was a storyteller, and at times a deeply controversial one. He boldly named the people who built Knossos the Minoans, after the mythical Minos. He interpreted symbols with confident authority, meticulously reconstructed fragile frescoes, and most controversially, restored significant portions of the palace using modern reinforced concrete, a decision that has drawn both fervent praise and sharp criticism. Some hail it as visionary preservation, others condemn it as archaeological vandalism. Because what you witness today at Knossos is a powerful blend, partly ancient ruin and partly Edwardian imagination. Still, Evans achieved what no one else had dared. He breathed new life into Knossos. He offered Europe a captivating glimpse into a Bronze Age world far older than classical Greece, revealing a sophisticated civilization defined by its art, its profound mystery, and its maritime elegance. He also unearthed the still undeciphered Linear A script, opening entirely new questions about ancient language, literacy, and the very limits of our historical understanding. But Evans did more than merely excavate stone. He resurrected a myth and compelled historians to grapple with the profound fact that behind the legendary Minotaur's labyrinth was something undeniably real, astonishingly complex, and deeply human. A sprawling palace that felt inherently like a maze,
a sophisticated civilization that mysteriously slipped into shadow, and a man who painstakingly peeled back the earth only to discover a story far stranger and more beautiful than he had ever imagined. Knossos had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that finally woke it up. Even the overall layout of Knossos may possess symbolic meaning. Some archaeologists theorize that it was constructed not merely for functional purposes, but to intricately mirror celestial or seasonal patterns. Its winding corridors and nested rooms could represent a profound journey through life, through death, or even through the underworld. A spiritual maze rather than a physical prison. But without a deciphered script, every theory walks a perilous thin line between insightful interpretation and pure imagination. The Minoans communicated in symbols, not in readily decipherable stories, and so we are left to interpret. What is Knossos truly telling us? We perceive the rhythms, we discern the images, but the ultimate meaning remains just out of reach, like a thread unraveling into myth. Knossos is a ruin, yes, but it doesn't feel lifeless. Walk its ancient corridors today, and you'll sense something humming just beneath the surface. Not ghosts, not literal gods, but powerful echoes of myths, of lives once lived, and of profound questions that stubbornly refuse to dissipate. Thousands of years after its mysterious fall, Knossos still holds us captive in its maze. Tourists wander its halls, archaeologists tirelessly dig for answers, and writers continually spin new tales inspired by its enduring shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth, but the visceral feeling of the labyrinth is undeniably real. We don't know the specific names of those who ruled Knossos, its kings, queens, or priests. We don't know the precise prayers they whispered, or the exact laws they lived by. But we know they cherished beauty. We know they deeply revered nature. We know they understood a profound balance between architectural grandeur and artistic expression, between sacred ritual and daily reality. And we know they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before the glory of Rome, before the Hebrew temples or the Persian palaces, there was Knossos, a palace that was also a city that was also a temple that may have also been a story. Because perhaps that's what the labyrinth truly is, not a grim prison, not a complex puzzle, but a powerful narrative carved in stone, a timeless myth in architectural form. The legend of the Minotaur did not arise from nothingness. It emerged directly from this place, from the disorienting confusion of its corridors, the profound reverence of its bull rituals, and the overwhelming awe it inspired in generations who desperately tried to comprehend it. The Greeks transformed it into a story. We, in modern times, have turned it into archaeology. But at its fundamental core, Knossos has always been both. Today we can walk its ruins in broad daylight. We can take countless photos, meticulously draw maps,
and even painstakingly reconstruct its fading frescoes. But the fundamental mystery has not vanished. The delicate line between historical fact and enduring legend still shimmers like heat haze over ancient stone. Perhaps that is why Knossos continues to endure, because it doesn't offer us all the answers. It reminds us that sometimes history isn't meant to be definitively solved. It's meant to be profoundly felt. And Knossos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a place on a map. It's a question, one that leads us deeper with every single step. And like Theseus, we are all still following the thread.
If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the cunning tactician. Where rams brutally smashed at close quarters, catapults launched devastating attacks from a safe distance, hurling not just stones, but psychological dread. They were the very first true artillery pieces in military history, and they revolutionized siege warfare by weaponizing physics in ways that felt almost magical or terrifying to the besieged enemy. The earliest catapults emerged from the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, the brilliant product of minds eager to add range and destructive momentum to warfare. Dionysus I of Syracuse, a tyrant with a distinct taste for cutting-edge violence, commissioned the first torsion-powered catapults, ingenious devices that harnessed the enormous potential energy stored in tightly twisted bundles of sinew or hair as tension springs. These were not mere oversized slingshots. They were precise, devastating instruments of siege terror. The true genius lay in their mechanics. Engineers meticulously figured out that by tightly twisting ropes, often meticulously crafted from animal sinew, they could store colossal amounts of potential energy. When suddenly released, this stored force could hurl stones, javelins, or even flaming projectiles hundreds of meters with terrifying accuracy. Two main types rapidly evolved: the ballista, which launched massive bolts like a giant crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which lobbed boulders over walls or directly at enemy fortifications. Then came the Roman engineers, who never encountered a Greek idea they couldn't significantly improve upon. They constructed catapults that could be ingeniously broken down, efficiently packed onto carts, and swiftly reassembled on site, creating truly portable siege engines for their professional armies. Some Roman catapults could fire 60-pound stones at incredible velocities, capable of tearing through wooden gates, shattering battlements, and occasionally pulverizing unlucky soldiers. Catapults weren't solely about physical destruction. They were about spectacle and psychological impact. Ancient generals shrewdly used them to send grim messages, sometimes literally. Corpses were launched over walls to spread disease and terror. Severed heads were lobbed into besieged cities to utterly shatter morale. In one chilling historical account, diseased bodies were fired into enemy territory as an early, terrifying form of biological warfare. However, catapults had their inherent flaws. They were heavy, demanded highly skilled crews, and could be rendered utterly useless by challenging terrain. Still, when meticulously set up,
they could relentlessly batter a city into submission from a safe, strategic distance. And for the very first time in history, cities realized their thick stone walls didn't just need to withstand a ram. They had to survive attacks from the skies, because now destruction came flying.
If the catapult was clever, the trebuchet was majestic. Towering, creaking, and profoundly terrifying, it was the undisputed king of medieval siege warfare. When one of these gargantuan machines appeared on the battlefield, it wasn't merely a weapon, it was a devastating statement. It bellowed, "Your walls mean absolutely nothing." Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet relied entirely on the fundamental force of gravity. At its core was a deceptively simple principle: a long, swinging arm mounted on a sturdy frame, with an immensely heavy counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. Raise the weight, let it drop, and the arm would whip around with incredible force, flinging the sling and its deadly payload in a high, arcing trajectory directly over enemy defenses. It was destruction under control, precise, predictable, and utterly devastating. The origin of the trebuchet can be traced back to early traction models used by the Chinese as far back as the 4th century BCE, where manpower replaced the counterweights. But the counterweight trebuchet, the version that would fundamentally rewrite siege warfare in Europe and the Islamic world, emerged in the 12th century, possibly through Byzantine or Muslim intermediaries. Once Europe gained access to this revolutionary design, it spread like wildfire through castles and crusades. Its power was astonishing. A well-built trebuchet could launch 300-pound projectiles over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture would crash into mighty towers, pulverize impenetrable walls, or utterly crater enemy morale. But the true magic lay in its high arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets could hurl projectiles over walls with remarkable finesse, meaning they weren't just smashing defenses, they were directly hitting courtyards, barracks, and vital supply depots inside the besieged fortress. And it wasn't just stones. Trebuchets hurled everything imaginable: diseased animal carcasses, barrels of burning pitch, pots of blinding lime to disorient defenders, even grim messages or taunting insults wrapped around rocks. One legendary account from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland tells of Warwolf, a trebuchet so colossally massive that the enemy surrendered before it was even fired. The king, however, famously refused to accept the surrender just so he could test the awe-inspiring machine. But for all its destructive glory, the trebuchet was not fast. It took many hours to painstakingly build, minutes to reload, and demanded highly skilled engineers to operate. Still, no other siege weapon combined range, brute force, and sheer psychological horror quite like it. It was the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer descending from the heavens. And when that massive counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While catapults launched from afar and battering rams smashed at the gates, siege towers adopted a far more personal and terrifying approach. They rolled directly up to the enemy's front door and delivered armed invaders right onto the battlements.
Imagine a towering wooden skyscraper on wheels, meticulously covered in wet hides to prevent fire, bristling with archers and spearmen. That was the siege tower, the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier combined with a mobile fortress. And when one of these colossal structures began rumbling inexorably toward your city walls, you knew unequivocally that the true fight was about to begin. Siege towers were not subtle. They were immense, audacious, and terrifyingly effective when deployed correctly. The Assyrians may have been among the first to utilize them in the 9th century BCE, but it was the Greeks, and especially the Hellenistic kingdoms, that pushed the design to theatrical extremes. During the famous siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, the Macedonian general Demetrius I, known as Polyarchetes, or besieger of cities, constructed a monumental 9-story tower called the Helipolis, meaning taker of cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, was equipped with multiple catapults, covered in protective iron plates, and moved by thousands of soldiers. Though it famously broke under its own immense weight, its ambition remained unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was simple. Walls only provide defense if you cannot bypass them. Siege towers completely eliminated that advantage by creating an elevated platform from which attackers could directly descend onto the battlements, entirely bypassing locked gates and perilous scaling ladders. From the top deck, archers could unleash a deadly rain of arrows down onto defenders, while troops on the lower levels prepared to board. However, these towering behemoths were not invincible. They were incredibly slow, vulnerable to getting bogged down in mud, and prime targets for defenders armed with fire arrows, rolling boulders, or even cleverly sabotaged terrain. Smart defenders would dig deep ditches, flood moats, or construct secondary inner walls, known as counterscarp defenses, specifically to impede a tower's approach. Still, when they worked spectacularly. A breach in the wall was one thing, but having your own ramparts suddenly swarming with enemy soldiers, that was pure chaos. Siege towers transformed the battlefield from a horizontal contest of strength into a vertical race for survival. They made height both an asset and a terrifying liability. And once the gangplank dropped from a siege tower onto the city walls, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. While rams smashed and trebuchets soared, some of the most devastating siege tactics unfolded silently underground. Siege tunneling, or sapping, was the dark art of defeating a city by literally removing the very ground it stood upon. The concept was ancient and horrifyingly effective. Dig a tunnel beneath the enemy's wall, meticulously prop it up with wooden supports, and then set those supports ablaze. When the timbers burned away, the tunnel inevitably collapsed, dragging the foundation of the massive wall down with it. One moment, your city stood strong and unyielding. The next, a colossal section of the outer wall crumbled like stale bread. This method lacked the visual glory of grand engines or thunderous launches, but tunneling was the slow, invisible killer of fortress warfare.
The Assyrians practiced early versions of it, but the technique reached its full brutal maturity with the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans attempted to tunnel beneath the walls, only for the cunning defenders to dig counter-tunnels and intercept them mid-dig, transforming the subterranean soil into a terrifying claustrophobic knife-fight nightmare. This defensive tactic became known as countermining, and it added an eerie, chilling element to siege warfare. Imagine soldiers digging in pitch darkness, hundreds of feet beneath the earth, straining to hear the faint sound of enemy picks. The moment they detected tapping, they would frantically race to intercept, often resulting in violent, claustrophobic skirmishes fought by flickering torchlight with only knives and shovels. There was no glory in it, just sheer terror, suffocating claustrophobia, and endless dirt. But when undermining succeeded, the results were utterly catastrophic. One of the most infamous examples occurred in 1215 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces expertly tunneled beneath the southern wall, packed the mine with highly flammable pig fat, and set it ablaze. The supports instantly collapsed, bringing down the entire tower above. The defenders were utterly stunned, and soon after they surrendered. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become grim specialists in identifying weak foundations, meticulously measuring the soil's behavior, and planning collapses with terrifying precision. They were at once geologists and demolitionists, and though tunneling required immense time, brutal labor, and a touch of madness, it proved one immutable truth about siege warfare. If you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below.
Not all the drama of siege warfare originated from the attackers. For every ram constructed or towering siege engine rolled forward, defenders possessed their own arsenal of deadly tricks, and sometimes those tricks were incredibly hot. Let's start with arguably the most terrifying of them all, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was a mysterious napalm-like substance that possessed an uncanny ability to stick to ships, walls, and flesh, and, most terrifyingly, continued burning even on water. Sprayed from siphons or hurled in fragile clay pots, it created scenes of pure, agonizing chaos. To this very day, no one knows the exact formula for its composition. The secret was so meticulously guarded that it died with the Byzantine Empire itself. But its effects were legendary. Entire enemy fleets were reduced to flaming skeletons within minutes. And that was just the beginning of thermal defenses. In more low-tech defenses, boiling liquids were the go-to weapons of choice. Scalding water, scorching oil, or even superheated sand would be poured from murder holes, those quaint, innocent-looking openings strategically placed in the ceilings of gateways or towers, directly onto invaders below. Boiling oil was especially feared. Unlike water, it stubbornly clung to skin, soaking into clothes and armor before igniting. Imagine ascending a siege ladder only to be greeted by an inferno you could never extinguish. Hot sand, though less visually dramatic, was vicious in its own right. It would insidiously slip into the tiny gaps of armor, particularly around the neck or wrists, inflicting agonizing second and third degree burns as it literally cooked the flesh beneath. It didn't look impressive from a distance, but it transformed bold warriors into mere seconds.
Defenders also relied on the good old laws of physics. Gravity became a weapon. Gigantic stones, massive logs, or even dead animals were dropped from parapets onto cumbersome siege engines or dense formations of troops. The objective wasn't just to kill, it was to simultaneously destroy the machines and shatter enemy morale. And then there were traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles transformed into intricate puzzles of pain, deliberately designed to slow, confuse, and punish any attacker. All of these ingenious defenses served one crucial purpose: delay. Every single minute a wall held firm was a minute closer to enemy supply lines running thin, to disease spreading rampantly in besieging camps, or to desperately needed reinforcements arriving. Siege warfare was, at its heart, a brutal game of attrition. And while the attackers had physics and raw force on their side, the defenders possessed ingenuity, intimate knowledge of their fortress, and a whole lot of boiling rage.
In siege warfare, raw physical destruction was only half the grim goal. The other, equally crucial half, was psychological domination, breaking the will of the defenders long before the mighty walls ever came down. Siege weapons were not merely tools of war. They were massive, creaking, flaming symbols of impending doom. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every arcing boulder flung by a trebuchet was meticulously designed to plant one terrifying seed in the minds of those behind the walls. You are not safe. Ancient commanders understood this profound truth. The Assyrians would openly parade their formidable siege engines, dragging them across vast deserts with elaborate fanfare, ensuring every rebellious city heard of their approach. The Romans strategically built their siege camps right in full view of the enemy, deliberately allowing defenders to watch as colossal battering rams were meticulously assembled and terrifying catapults were test-fired. Siege was, in essence, theater, and fear was an integral part of the terrifying script. Sometimes the very payloads themselves carried a chilling message. Severed heads of messengers or enemy generals would be launched over the walls, often still wearing their armor, a grotesque warning of what awaited. At the siege of Constantinople, defenders were bombarded not only with rocks, but with bodies, diseased corpses launched with the express purpose of spreading panic and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it is widely believed that hurling plague-infected corpses over the walls contributed to triggering the devastating outbreaks of the Black Death in Europe.
The trebuchet was not just a weapon, it was a terrifying announcement. When one of these giants was slowly rolled into place, everyone inside the fortress could hear its ominous presence long before they saw it. The creaking of winches, the grinding of ropes, the heavy thud of the counterweight, like the relentless heartbeat of an incoming storm. But the most dangerous part was the unknown. You never knew what terror was coming next. Would it be a massive rock, a barrel of searing fire, a deadly rain of arrows, or just an eerie, heavy silence as the engineers meticulously adjusted their aim. Even the sounds themselves became potent psychological weapons. The rhythmic thump of a battering ram, or the sudden pregnant silence before a devastating shot, would drive defenders to the brink of madness with anticipation. For commanders, the ultimate goal was to induce utter despair, to convince the enemy that resistance was futile, that their gods had abandoned them, and that their formidable walls were nothing more than temporary obstacles in the inexorable path of fate.